Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Today I had a very weirdly shaped leftover piece of fabric that I wanted to turn into a garment. And originally I had hoped to be able to make a skirt out of it, but there was just no fitting that on there. And then I tried to fit a top with an all-in-one sleeve that we know I like so much onto the weird piece of fabric I left over, and that didn't quite work either. So I had to just, go for something completely outside of my comfort zone and once again make something sleeveless. And I don't make separates too often here on the channel, but I certainly don't make sleeveless things or 1960s inspired things very often. And that is kind of what was inspiring me for this particular top. I kind of wanted to create a 1960s shell sort of top, something that I could style for daytime or evening, but with a little bit of sparkle, which we will add on at the end. And in realizing I needed to make a sleeveless garment, I realized it would be a good opportunity to show you all how to do an all-in-one facing where you face the armholes and the neck at the same time in a garment like this one. So I'll show you what I mean over on the blue patterning table of doom, as always. And we begin with the tracing of my bodice front. That's right, I'm going to be using my regular bodice block for this, and I'm just going to trace in my darts. I was thinking here that I might move them, so I'm tracing in the dart legs and connecting them to the apex, but in the end, I ended up not moving my darts, so they are exactly where they are on my block, actually. And you can see I have already adjusted the neckline a little bit here. I will bring that a little bit closer to the neck here. Yeah, see? But I've just made this a very little short V-neck, and I'm going to extend the shoulder a 1/4 of an inch out here just because since there's no sleeve going into this, I want as much shoulder as I can get out of this. So just eking that out a little bit here. But in general, I'm not changing my block pattern very much at all. I will be adding a peplum to this. And then, of course, we're about to draft the facing. But in general, it's basically just my block pattern without sleeves on it. Let's just go ahead and tape some paper together here. If you hear weirdness in the background, it's not thunder this time. It is my cats with their zoomies upstairs, running around, chasing after little springs. I'm just going to go ahead and trace the pattern basically through here, the entire top half of this pattern here. For some reason I only made this 2 inches on the underarm. It should be 2.5. But you just connect, instead of making a separate neck facing and a separate armhole facing, you just connect the whole thing like this, and the entire sort of strap area, shoulder area of this will be covered. That will be all right. You'll see exactly how I sew this momentarily, in a few minutes actually. But I'm going to cut this out. This will be just cut on the fold along the front, just like this piece will be as well. And I will cut this out as well. We will have our fronts all ready to go. But very simple to draft that facing that just encompasses all of this up here. Of course, you could line a garment like this as well, but I wanted to keep this a nice breathable cotton top as much as possible because it will be for summer. And here for the back, I've just traced the back, including the dart, and I'm just adding an overlap here. I went 3/4 of an inch out from the center back as my overlap, and then I add an additional 2 inches onto that to be like a facing that flaps inside. So you'll see how I finish that later for the buttons down the back of this top. Just labeling this a little bit so don't get confused. So this is where it folds, this is the center back, this is the facing, all that stuff. But other than that, I will just cut this out. Again, I've added that same 1/4 inch along to the top of the shoulder seam as well, or the arm side, I guess. But other than that, this again is just my dart on the back of my regular bodice pattern. And again, we'll trace a facing by tracing the top of this entire pattern here. And I'll just use the front as a template for this, which means that this is all 2 inches instead of 2.5, but whatever. Basically just curving this in here, drawing a nice shape. This is the back facing. Sequin top, 2022, back facing. This does not extend, the back of this does not extend all the way into the full overlap, and you'll see why later. It just doesn't have to. You can either have the overlap cover that area or the facing. You'll see what I mean later. But for the peplum of this, I'm just going to trace the top 6 inches of my A-line skirt pattern. If you need to make an A-line skirt pattern, I have a video on that here. But I just have all my overlap on this, and I'm not going to use all of that later. So I really didn't need to have the 2-inch facing on this piece as well. I could have just done 1/2 inch seam allowance, but you'll see how I adjust for that later when we get to that point. But I'm just cutting this out, so it's just the top of my A-line skirt pattern, which I know the waist fits into my waist of my bodice. So that was for the back, and this is going to be the front. But again, I'm just tracing the top, 6 inches of this. I think it's 5.5 inches. My peplum on this one total. But you can trace as long of a peplum as you would like. You can change the shape of the hem if you would like. You may have seen that in my wrap back top peplum video recently, which I can put a card up to here as well. I quite like that top. I've made another one since. Now here's my weirdly leftover piece of, this is actually cotton ottoman. It has a little bit of stretch to it. Cotton ottoman is like a cotton, ribbed fabric. It's not like a fail, but it's not like one. So it has, some of the threads are a thicker yarn so that it has a little bit of a ribbed texture up close. This does have a slight stretch to it, and in fact I have such a weird, awkward, less than a yard really of this left that I'm ending up going to cut one of the back pieces on the cross grain and one on the lengthwise grain, which is not ideal because again, this does have a little bit of stretch. So one of the pieces at the back, the stretch will be going top to bottom instead of side to side. Not exactly ideal, but we're making it work with what we had left over, you know? And because I didn't have very much of that fabric left over, I'm going to cut the facings out of black sateen and cut the peplum lining out of this random, lightweight green polyester lining I had left over from another project. Because I didn't want to use the sateen on the peplum, it would just be quite thick when I'm sewing the peplum to the waist of the top and stuff, so I wanted to keep it quite thin down here. So I'm just going to use the polyester to line this peplum. And here I'm pinning the side seams of my peplum, the outside layer, together. And I will go ahead and do the same for the green lining pieces for that, just pinning the left and rights together. Basically, the front is of course cut on the fold, and the back will open because I'm going to have buttons down the back of this blouse. And for those of you who have noticed that I have a ton of bandages on my right arm, I will put the TMI version of this in the description, but basically, sometimes when you rescue kittens and save them from a life of shelters and weirdness, they bring weirdness with them. So unfortunately, my cats have given me a little bit of a rash on my arm, which has caused a lot of delays in filming because I want to be a pristine human when I film things, especially lookbooks I've been looking forward to. So we have had a few delays here in the studio, thanks to the cats that have nothing to do with the cats actually distracting me, which is what they usually do, but actually infecting me this time. So that's a shame, but I still love them. And my right arm will recover. We're on the mend now. I just have to keep things covered, which requires me to have a lot of band-aids on. And honestly, the band-aids have been the major problem. The rash that they gave me, again, TMI, so sorry, is fine. It doesn't really hurt or anything. It's not even that gruesome to look at. It's just like little red marks. But the band-aids have been, the various band-aids I've been trying. I'm not usually allergic to adhesives, but they've been, a couple of them decided to rip my skin right off with them. So I have more bruising and injuries from the band-aid tape itself than from the actual situation, which is a shame. And again, all of that was probably to TMI, so sorry. If you're new here, you're like, wow, this girl is a lot. And I apologize. I am just marking my darts on the back pieces and now on the front as well, because I have all these darts to sew, of course, which will be no problem in this cotton, which is the nice thing about cotton. I'm just marking those in colored pencil, of course. We know how I like to mark my darts in semi-permanent situations, and it's too bad, but oh well. It's really with this textured cotton, using the chalk on it results in a very thick line, so I really don't like using tailored chalk on something like this. Tailored chalk really works on something that's finer and smoother best, honestly. But I can go ahead and just pin all these darts, and I'm setting everything next to the machine at the end of the blue patterning table of doom. And I can come over here and start sewing those darts. Again, starting at the large end of the dart, as always. A little bit of back stitching, using a small stitch length, sewing off the end of the point here, and then tying my tails shut in a knot, how I always sew my darts. Even these giant waist darts that I have going on here. Even in a fabric that is a little bit on the thicker this side, it almost would be better to trim these darts, but I ended up leaving them in here. Creates rather a structured top. It's one of those things where you can almost set the top up, it'll almost stand on its own, because this fabric does have a bit of structure to it. It feels almost like the weight of a cotton twill, I would say, but it doesn't have diagonal stripes like a twill weave does. It just has some ribbing going on. Can't really tell unless you're right up close to it or feeling it yourself. And I'm just sewing those side seams of my lining for the peplum here. Again, using my 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual, and because I have my fine silk pins, sewing right over them as we know I like to do. Again, I have a blood pact with my machine. That means that it doesn't hit pins. If you haven't done any magic with yours, I suggest it, honestly. It's very great for a lazy seamstress like myself to not have to remove the pins. I am kidding, but I just don't often hit them with my needle. People always think that this is a very hazardous situation, but for me, I have found that it's fine. But you sew over your pins at your own discretion, honestly. And sewing the side seams of my peplum for the outside as well, and then I will sew the darts for my back bodice pieces. Like so. And people are stomping around upstairs. What else is new? I just go ahead and press those darts here over my tailor's ham, and then I eventually just give up and use the end of the ironing board, because it is my preferred spot to iron darts. But I'm just pressing those down for the side darts and towards the center of the waist for my waist darts, or center of the front. Just give this a little bit of a press. I'm only going to serge the raw edges of the side seams and the waist seam, I think I did on this one. Waist seam more to just to make it not stretch, and the side seams because that would be the only seam on the inside of this that will be exposed in the end, really. I do need to serge the center backs of this, which I do later because I Wasn't sure exactly how I was going to finish it at this point, and I just left it for later. Go ahead and serge those side seams and waist seams of my bodice pieces. And then for this peplum, everything will be fully lined on this peplum, so I didn't bother to serge anything. But I'm going to go ahead and put right sides together of my lining and my outside fabric, and I can go ahead and stitch the hem of this, and then I will understitch it as well. Really just finish this peplum off except for the waist seam, because that is where I will attach it to the garment later. It's kind of making two separate things, a peplum and a top, and then I will later attach them. But for now, I can grab my facing pieces. I just serged the raw edge at the bottom of these, because again, that will be the only spot that is exposed inside the top later. But I'm just going to give those a quick press, and I will sew the shoulder seams together on these. Not the side seams, just the shoulder seams, okay? So that we can fully face this garment, both at the neckline and the arm, all in one. I'll show you what I mean. But we're just going to layer up these shoulder seams, pin those, set that next to the machine, and then I'll do the same for the bodice pieces as well. We're going to sew the shoulder seams on the bodice at the same time, like so. And yes, this is rather a loud and bright and exciting fabric for me. I made a dress out of this recently, and then this was the leftovers, and I really wanted to try again to eke out another garment, so I thought I was able to make something even if it is sleeveless. I'm just stitching those shoulder seams over here, again 1/2 inch seam allowance as always, over on the machine like so, and then I will do the same for the shoulder seams of my garment. Again, just using a 12 stitches per inch. Here's my preferred over here in black Gutermann thread. And my goodness, do I go through black Gutermann thread quite quickly. It's true. But my tattoo has healed up quite well, so that's something. At least my left arm is doing well, even if my right arm is not quite up to speed. We'll get there. I'm just giving it a little bit more time before I film this next lookbook I want to do. You may have seen a couple of teases on Instagram if you're following me over there on Instagram. It is inspired by a certain filmmaker, and I was trying to see if anyone could guess. I have one more tease that I'm going to put up on Instagram today that should, again, be obvious for those who know and very confusing for those who do not. But all will be revealed eventually, and I will recommend all the films that I am secretly referencing to. Mostly just because I'm mostly being cryptic, just because I want people to guess. And there have been a couple people who've guessed, which made me happy. Because even with my vague hints, people have been able to guess what vibe I might be going for. Clearly you are my people out there who have watched these foreign films. But I am quite enamored with myself. I would say they're in my top 10, you know. But I'm just clipping my curve of my peplum here because it is a curve and I want it to lie nice and smooth. So I'll clip this curve and I kind of give this a quick, well, I move my confetti that I just made out of this nonsense. Throw that away. But I'm just going to quickly press this lining kind of towards the seam allowance. That way I can stitch it down to the seam allowance when I do my understitching in just a moment. Because I will understitch this whole curved edge so that this lining stays nice and curves towards the inside when it comes to wearing this top later. I'm just going to line that up. Again, the seam allowance is underneath the lining here. And I'm actually going to stay away from the edges because I knew, like somehow in my brain I knew that I had made them too long and I was going to have to trim this later. So I just left myself a couple of inches excess at the ends of this for adjustment later. How much under an overlap I wanted to have at the center back of this peplum, basically. But just stitching along here. Again, just using my presser foot as a guide for that because I have that narrow side of this vintage presser foot. We all know how I love my vintage machine. I never thought I would be a vintage machine person, and yet I am quite devoted. I was actually just thinking, I kind of want to do a couple of more sewing-ish themed, possibly additions of ink onto my more inked arm now. And I was thinking, oh, wouldn't it be fun to get the serial number from this machine? I don't know why I had that thought. I don't think I need to, but it was just a random thought I had because that's how attached I am to this machine now. Some people get their children's names. I'll get the serial number for my 99K. No, I won't. I'll stick to botanicals for now. Let me just press open my shoulder seams, like so. And then I will press open the shoulder seams on the facing as well. Over here. Nice, smooth black cotton sateen. Plenty of that hanging around the studio right now to use for this. Lend my shoulders a little bit of structure here. I'll take anything I can get with this sleeveless garment. But I'm going to lay down my top. This, again, the side seams are open still, so I can lay this in a top-down way like this. I'm going to put the facing on here, right sides together, and I'm going to pin the armholes and pin the neckline, and we're going to sew both of those in this like sort of top-down flat way for now, and then we'll sew the side seams later. So go ahead and pin this whole neckline with, again, my nice fine silk pins. These are by Dritz, by the way, as many pins are, honestly. They make a lot of sewing notions. They are a little bit on the pricey side. I can use them for a while, especially, I mean, they bend a little bit after a while, after use, but I get a good several months out of them before I have to buy another box, which is nice. But I'll pin this last arm side the same way here, and then I'll take this over to the machine and again sew on these facings, just following a curve with that half-inch seam allowance. We'll have to clip these curves, and I even bother to grade the seam allowances today, which I'll show you what I mean. It's when you kind of trim the seam allowances so that they taper as opposed to just being bulky in here. And that's just because, again, the sateen mixed with the ottoman at the top of this is a little bit on the thicker side. But I don't mind extra structure around the shoulder seam, whereas I don't like extra bulk around the waist seam, which would make sense because I'm always trying to make the shoulders bigger and the waist look smaller in my sewing. I'm a very devoted to the hourglass silhouette, as we know. Mostly because for a long time I hated my hourglass silhouette, and then I learned that it kind of worked for vintage, and then I was already obsessed with historic costume anyway, so then I got really obsessed with vintage, and here we are. Instead of trying to make my body work for the fashions that were currently in fashion, I just found where in the timeline my body worked with the clothes, and it was like the quote-unquote more ideal. Still not the ideal. I'm very curvy for the mid-century, but it works. We're making it work. I got tired of hating my body. It was enough. Here I am trimming the facing side of that. So I'm just trimming about 1/4 inch off so that the seam allowances are not ending at the exact same spot. And then I will clip my curves about every 3/4 of an inch or so. The closer your clips, like I wouldn't go closer than 1 centimeter away from one another, but the closer your clips, the smoother the line will be, honestly. And since it's all going to be encased, it's not really a worry about fraying and stuff like that. I will clip the center V of my neckline here, and then again trim these seam allowances and clip my curves for the neckline as well. Then I can turn this all and hopefully do a little bit of understitching, although this is going to be an interesting understitching experience because it's all sewn at once like this. Alright, so lay that out, and then I can go ahead and I'm going to reach through the tube of the shoulder of the facing to the back, grab the entire back piece, and pull it right side out through that shoulder. Like so. Same over here. Reaching my arm through that little tunnel of facing, grabbing the entire back and pulling it through, and now everything is right side out and faced seamlessly and nicely. Of course, this all needs to be pressed, but before that I'm going to try and squeeze in here and get as much understitching done for the neckline and for the arm size as I can, because of course that will help keep the lining folded to the inside and nice and smooth when I'm wearing this top later. Luckily the, cotton ottoman isn't rough in any way, it's just a little bit rougher than this smooth sateen, so it'll be nice to have the smooth sateen against my skin up here. I know some people have sensory issues. I'm not really too sensitive to that, luckily, because I like using strange fabrics, so it would be very irritating for me if I couldn't put up with it. But I kind of have a suffer for fashion mentality. I used to wear high heels all day to school and high school and stuff like that. And when I say high heels, I mean very high heels. Because I thought it was fashionable for some reason. I don't know. I was very devoted to Vogue and Elle and was obsessed with high fashion when I was a youngin'. And that's why I went to become a fashion designer. I went to fashion school. But of course, in fashion school I learned that the industry is interesting and that I didn't want to be part of it. I started looking at historic costume. Started wanting to work in museums by the end of my time at university. And then I learned that museums wanted me to stay in university for another 4 years or whatever. And I couldn't afford to do that. And now here we are on YouTube, But I am very happy here. And I'm happy to demonstrate sewing online and share the gift of pattern drafting, hopefully, because I just think more people should be pattern drafting. And so if I can convince 1 or 2 people even to give pattern drafting a try, I will have considered it a success, because it's changed my sewing journey for sure. When I first got to fashion school, I was worried that it was going to be very difficult, and luckily pattern drafting, as you may have noticed, comes quite naturally to me, actually. But now that my facings are all sewn and pressed in here, and understitched as best as I can sew my side seams together. So I'm just going to sew the side seam together, including the facing, all at once like this. Then I can fold that facing down inside and everything will be nicely, smoothly finished. So nice. I actually haven't, because I don't make sleeveless garments very often, I haven't done one of these in a long time. And it is so satisfying to have this all-in-one facing up here and all smooth and nice and finished. I want to make more, even though I don't really like wearing sleeveless things. Again, this is outside my comfort zone. Speaking of body image issues, the last hanger-on I have is that I don't really like my upper arms. And I am thinking of solving that issue, at least on my left arm, by putting some peonies on it in ink, and maybe I'll like it better then. We'll see how it goes. I'm just sewing that again. Half-inch seam allowance, as always, over here. It's very rare that I use a different seam allowance. Well, I guess the center backs of my garments I usually leave 1 inch. But most of the time, 1/2 inch. That's what I was taught in fashion school, once again. Things that hang on from school days. Wish I had one of those nice irons that they had. They had one of those gravity feed, like big, epic irons in fashion school. I'm surprised I never burnt myself on one of those. I burn myself on this one all the dang time. But that's because I'm clumsy. I tend to burn myself with anything that is available to... I don't... With an open flame, with candles, I'm pretty good. But other than that, I have like set paper towels on fire in the kitchen. I burn myself on kitchen pans and stuff like that all the dang time. And I hit myself with this iron. Or like reach to grab something and have the iron hit the back of my arm or something. All the time. Anyone who thinks I have any elegance, again, it is all an illusion, sadly. But I'm just pinning that facing down to the seams on the inside because I can tack it there later and you'll see that. But now I'm going to just kind of pre-fold my facings of this back overlap, or like back, what is it called? Placket. Yeah, there we go. Found the word. For my buttons and buttonholes back here on each side. I'm just folding that over the 2 inches that I had left myself. And you can kind of either have this go like this or like this, you know what I mean? So you can either have the facing cover that top area, or you can have the fold back. And I'm just having the fold back this time. No big deal. Once again, who will be inside my clothes except for me? That's right, no one. Anyway, and so I'm just pressing this all into place. Press this back. And then I will attach the peplum before I actually do the buttons and buttonholes. I like to do the buttons and buttonholes last, even though that does make me nervous, because it's like if the buttonhole machine eats my garment at the end, I will be very disappointed, but that's alright. Like so, give this a nice press. And I haven't put any interfacing in here yet, but I do actually, because this fabric is quite thick and stable, I didn't feel like I needed it. You'll notice I didn't interface my facing either. That's because sateen, again, is kind of on the thicker side. I don't really feel like I need interfacing with that. If I was using a voile or even maybe a poplin, I would have interfaced it, but for this, it's just not necessary. Here I am realizing I don't need this 2 inches of overlap. So I'm going to cut off 1.5 inches, leaving myself a 1/2 inch of seam allowance to be able to just finish these. And I'll just pin them and actually sew this back closed along this line here. So I'll just sew that, trim my corners, all that jazz finally, because I knew that these needed to be shorter. And for some reason, I just couldn't correct it until I was in the middle of sewing it. The pattern needs to just be cut off. I think I've cut off the pattern for next time, hopefully, if I make this top again. But yes, let me just trim those corners, press this using a knitting needle. So just poke those corners out so they're nice and sharp down here. And again, give this a nice press. Nice thing about both polyester lining and cotton is that they hold a press so nice and well. You can see I've got the clapper right there, and yet am I using my hand? Yes, the answer is yes. Every once in a while I remember to use the clapper instead of my hand. Now I'm going to take the fashion fabric layer of the peplum and of the top, and I'm going to leave the lining free for now because I'll use that to encase this seam layer, but I'm going to sew the waistline seam of the peplum and the top together. So just pin all of that. And then we can kind of use the lining of the peplum to cover all of this later. And you can see my buttons just up atop a screen here that I'm going to use for this. Some black plastic buttons. They look almost like glass jet buttons, but of course they are plastic. And they are very fun. I did have a button back top, similar-ish to this. Of course, it had my all-in-one sleeve that I do quite like, but I used like vintage or antique glass buttons down the back of it, and one of the buttons did break, and so now I have to move the buttons around or replace them or find one that will match. So that is a hazard when you are silly like me and you put it in the wash on delicate cycle, even though it has glass buttons. Not recommended. That washing machine will still shatter your buttons. It's unfortunate. But now that this is sewn on, see, I've just pressed everything up towards the waist, and I'm pressing all the seam allowance down, including that fold back, and I can just fold this edge of the lining under and encase everything in this, and it will be nice and finished here along the waist seam. So I'm pressing that seam allowance down. This just gets folded in that 1/2 inch along the peplum, and then I can pin this in place, and I will slip stitch this down to the seam allowance in here. I didn't putting a little bit of clip in here because of course this is curved, and so to fold over nicely it does need a little bit of a clip. But in general I can just fold under this lining over the seam allowance, and then I will seamlessly slip stitch this down by hand, of course. I do enjoy a little bit of hand finishing now and again. I'm not afraid to get in here. You could stitch this from the outside with the machine, by the way, especially if you stitched in the ditch of the waist seam. You could probably get away with that. But it doesn't take too long to hand stitch this, so I don't mind. I'll just pin the whole thing like that, and then I'll show you how I slip stitch this down. Again, where it is curved, I'm putting little clips in here. I'm not putting the full like 1/2 inch of clip in that. Just like clipping a 1/4 of an inch maybe. Just to give me the, facilitate the folding of it all, basically. I'll clip my seam allowance properly in here too. The more clips, the smoother things will be. Something I definitely had it drilled into me by teachers in fashion school is not to skip clipping your seams. A lot of people did, that's why. I think they just got really tired of telling students like, who are like, why does this look terrible? And they're like, yeah, did you clip your curves at all? No. Okay, well there you go. But I'm just slip stitching, taking a little bit of bite out of that seam allowance, a little bit out of the fold of the lining, going along here, taking larger-ish stitches. Again, I'm still lazy. But it will hold, it will do its job, and we have this nice, smooth, finished edge in here along the waist seam, and even along this placket, like so. I'm just using doubled thread on a needle for that. Same Gutermann thread that I use for everything else. I really should just buy black Gutermann thread in bulk, honestly. I definitely need to do that with serger thread because I ran out of black serger thread the other day and I was very upset because I was really ready to finish the project I was working on. Instead, I had to run to Joann's the next day and get black serger thread. Dang it. Why don't I just keep a ton of it on hand? I don't know. I guess I'm not used to the idea of having money for supplies like that, but technically, thanks to the generosity of my patrons, I could probably make that happen and just actually have things on hand. But I'm just going to tie off my thread here in this area where it's serged along the back and just trim that. If I had made these facings, the back fold back wider, by the way, I could have folded it in a 1/2 inch and then just had that serged edge like folded in and have it really smooth in here. But I just knew I didn't have very much of this fabric left, so I wanted to keep the pieces as narrow as possible. And then I can come up here while I have my needle threaded and just throw a couple of stitches down to whip stitch this edge of the facing to my seam allowance up here at the side seam under the arm. And that'll just keep things from flipping around and flooping around on me while I'm trying to wear this garment later or wash it. I can still hand wash this. I could throw this in the machine, really, honestly, at this point, but I'm going to do some embellishment later that will mean that hand washing is probably preferable. Just cutting a little bit of lightweight interfacing again. I decided to interface the buttonhole side of this after I had, you know, almost finished the back of this, so it's not an ideal time to add interfacing. But we're going to make it work. As Tim Gunn would say, make it work. Yes, I did watch Project Runway when I was a teenager, but I absolutely detest reality TV, which is funny because I love YouTube, which some would argue is reality TV in some ways, but I hate actual reality TV because I just don't like all the drama and the false weirdness that producers add as if we don't know that it's scripted in some way. I just can't. I cannot stand reality TV, so I do not partake. I guess I don't partake in a ton of TV in general. I like my Star Wars stuff, of course, even the animated stuff. I loved Arcane, speaking of animated stuff. Whew, Arcane, amazing. If you haven't watched it and you like art or story in any way, shape, or form, you gotta go on to Netflix and watch Arcane. It's amazing. And I liked Game of Thrones for the first few seasons, but you know. I'm gonna go ahead and do my buttonholes over here while I'm rambling about TV for some goodness knows why reason. I'm switching my machine over here to have the Singer buttonholer on it. You may have seen this in one of my other videos before. This is a vintage buttonholer attachment for this vintage Singer machine. I think it's attached to any of these, the style of machine basically. But you can put different cams or like templates in the back of this to decide how big you want your buttonhole to be. I'm just going to do a test here on a little, the very last scrap of this ottoman that I had because I didn't have very much leftover fabric for this. But I just wanted to do a test buttonhole to see how this would come out. I'm doing these at a 15/16 of an inch, so basically an inch buttonhole. for my inch size buttons. I'm just seeing how that's going to work. Looks like it's going to be fine. And a good thing to note for this too is before you get this all set up, make sure you have a full bobbin of thread, because if you're going through here and making your buttonholes and you run out of bobbin thread, you're going to be extra sad. And you wouldn't want that to happen. But this just, you kind of just set it exactly where you need it to go, and then you just press the pedal and you don't have to, it's very hands off. It kind of clamps the fabric and does its thing. I usually go around 2 times or 3 times depending on how thick or like robust of a buttonhole I want. I think I went around 3 times on this just because the ottoman does fray a little bit, so I wanted to make sure that that was encased, these edges of the buttonholes here. And you can get a better look at the print of this fabric in here. It's got all kinds of different colors. It does have a lot of chartreuse or like lime green, so I was happy about that. And you can see I even check my bobbin a couple of times while I'm doing this because I just want to make sure I'm not running out of thread before I start one of these buttonholes. But again, yeah, it just clamps onto the fabric. It really holds it in place. There's that little needle plate cover that comes with this. If you have an older machine like this, I highly recommend having one of these buttonholers. They make really nice buttonholes compared to a lot of modern machines I've seen. And actually in fashion school, they had a room full of like ancient old, more like industrial sewing machines. Like really industrial, like factory floor for sure industrial machines. And they had a machine that was like this giant machine that looked like it was like for fixing cars, but it was for just doing buttonholes. I'm sure you could do any kind of buttonhole, that thing. But it was this absolutely gargantuan machine. I don't know why it needed to be so huge. I can't even imagine how they got it into that room because I don't know how it got through the doorway, and I don't know how heavy that thing must be because it looked like it's like a small elephant of a machine. But I'm just marking my spots on the other side where the buttons need to go so I can sew those on like so. And now I have the back buttonable so I can get in and out of this garment like so. And then technically this would be done. You know, it's all finished, ready to wear, except for I want to add some embellishment to this because as bright and weird as this is, I think I need to add sequins. So I'm going to go ahead and put sequins on all the pink areas of the print. There are like light pink areas of this print. And I'm going to put sequins on all the red and like rust berry weirdness on this. So I'm going to start that. I just have doubled thread on a beading needle to do that. I'm going to come up from the underside of the fabric here. I'm going to grab a sequin like so. Of course, this footage is not in focus, which passed me. If only I could have noticed this. Then I'm going to thread on a bead, and then I'm going to go back through just the sequin, and that bead kind of holds the sequin flat against the garment. And I'll come up a little bit away and just keep sequining, and then a bead, and then back down through the sequin, and the bead just holds the sequin onto the surface of the fabric. You can see up in the right hand corner, I've filled in that pink petal up there. In the same way with these flat iridescent sequins, I believe these are a size 8 sequin. Yes, sequins do come in sizes. If you need a good resource for sequins or just want to lose a half hour to browsing sequins, I recommend Cartwright's sequins. I can link them below. They're my favorite resource for stocking up on sequins. And I do love a sequin, personally. I know not everyone likes them. Maybe they're tacky. I bet you a lot of things I like are tacky. But that's okay. I don't mind. I'd rather have fun. Life is short, you know? Them's the facts. I'll just tie this off on the underside, since this little tiny pink area is done. I just tie off a knot on the back of this, and clip that off, and I just do various areas in that same way. And here is my finished 1960s inspired shell top, sleeveless top here with the buttons down the back. Of course, I always get questions about how you button these buttons, and the answer is you do as many as you can reach, and then you ask someone to do up the last few for you. So the answer is I do not live alone, and usually I just find my mom. That won't work forever, because eventually I do hope to move out of this house, and then hopefully I'll just have friendly enough ghosts that don't mind doing up a couple for me. I do have a lot more sequining to do on this. I have about 4 hours of sequining in on this top so far, and I think I need at least another 4 hours to completely cover all the pink and red with iridescent sequins, and I may choose to cover a couple more colors with sequins as well. We'll see how it goes. I do have all of these colors of sequins because I collect sequins. Even that I like collecting. So I do have a little bit more work to do on this, a couple more hours of beading, a few more nights probably, hopefully listening to a podcast or two while I get that done. And I do have several sewing videos coming up for you that are kind of halfway done filming. I'm just waiting until I'm a little bit less bandaged to, you know, do the modeling sort of end portions of those. I just have had a few delays here, slightly health related. I mean, I'm fine. I feel fine. I'm just waiting to look better again because I like to be as pristine as possible for these sort of things. I only get glammed up every so often. I want to do it all the way. But thank you as always for your patience and for your support here on the channel. I will be back here with more vintage fashion, sewing, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.